I still remember the day we set foot on the island like it was yesterday. It was a crisp morning in April, and our team of scientists had been planning this expedition for months. We were a diverse group, each with their own area of expertise, but we shared one common goal: to uncover the secrets of the Pacific's most isolated and enigmatic landmass. The island, known only as Kahuna, was shrouded in mystery, its dense rainforests and towering volcanic peaks hiding secrets that had eluded humanity for centuries. Our team leader, Dr. Isaac Newton, stood at the helm of our research vessel, the Horizon's Edge. He was a renowned expert in paranormal phenomena and had spent years studying the strange occurrences surrounding Kahuna. As we approached the island's shores, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy, like the island itself was waiting for us. We began our descent onto the sandy beach, our footsteps echoing through the stillness. The forest loomed before us, its canopy a kaleidoscope of greens and browns that seemed to swallow the sunlight whole. Our team fanned out, each member assigned to a specific task. Dr. Newton and I were tasked with setting up the research equipment, while others began to explore the island's interior. As we worked, the silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. It was as if the island itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to make our move. We spent hours setting up the research equipment, our fingers numb from the cold and our eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Dr. Newton seemed particularly excited, his eyes shining with an uncharacteristic intensity as he worked to calibrate the equipment. I tried to focus on my own task, but my mind kept wandering back to the island's strange aura. It was as if the very air around us was charged with anticipation, like we were waiting for something or someone. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the forest, our team leader called out that it was time to break camp and begin exploring the island's interior. We packed up our gear and followed Dr. Newton into the dense undergrowth, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the trees. The air grew thick with humidity, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my face as we pushed deeper into the forest. Every step seemed to take us further from civilization, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being led deeper into a trap. Dr. Newton stopped suddenly, his head cocked to one side as he listened intently. "What is it?" I whispered, my heart racing with anticipation. He didn't answer, but instead began to make his way up a narrow stream, his eyes fixed on some point ahead. We followed him, our footsteps echoing through the silence, until we emerged into a clearing that took my breath away. The island's interior was unlike anything I had ever seen: towering palm trees, their trunks thick and gnarled, stretched towards the sky like nature's own cathedral. And in the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone structure, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. As we approached the ancient stone structure, I could feel a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into my bones. The air around us grew colder, and the symbols etched into the stone appeared to shift and writhe like living serpents. Dr. Newton seemed undaunted, his eyes fixed intently on the structure as if drawn by some unseen force. He began to examine the symbols more closely, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns with a reverence that bordered on the fanatical. I watched in amazement as he revealed hidden compartments and secret passages, each one leading deeper into the heart of the structure. As we explored, the silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the sound of our own ragged breathing and the creaking of the ancient stone beneath our feet. It was as if we were trespassers in a place where we didn't belong, and that the island itself was warning us to turn back. But Dr. Newton pressed on, driven by some unseen compulsion to uncover the secrets hidden within the structure. We explored room after room, each one filled with strange artifacts and relics that seemed to hold a dark and malevolent power. I began to feel like we were being herded towards some unknown fate, as if the island itself was orchestrating our descent into madness. And then, in the depths of the structure, we stumbled upon a door that seemed to have been deliberately hidden from view. It was old and worn, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to match those on the walls. Dr. Newton's eyes lit up with excitement as he reached out to touch the door, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that we were about to uncover secrets that were meant to remain hidden. As Dr. Newton pushed the door open, a warm golden light spilled out, illuminating the dark recesses of the structure. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing off the walls as we made our way deeper into the heart of the island. The air was thick with an otherworldly scent, like incense or something more sinister. I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched, and my skin prickled with goosebumps as I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. Dr. Newton seemed oblivious to it all, his eyes fixed intently on a series of ancient artifacts arranged on a pedestal in the center of the room. They glowed with an ethereal light, casting flickering shadows on the walls as we drew closer. I felt a strange energy building inside me, like my cells were being rearranged by some unseen force. The air seemed to vibrate with power, and I couldn't help but wonder what kind of forces we had disturbed by our presence. Dr. Newton reached out to touch one of the artifacts, and as he did, the room was filled with a blinding flash of light. When my vision cleared, we found ourselves standing in a vast, open space, surrounded by towering pillars that seemed to stretch up to the sky. The air was alive with a swirling mist that seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. I felt like we were walking into the very heart of madness itself. As we stood there, surrounded by the swirling mist, Dr. Newton began to pace back and forth in front of us, his eyes shining with excitement. "This is it," he exclaimed, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the proof we've been searching for." He stopped in front of me, his gaze intense. "You see, this island is not just any ordinary place. It's a nexus point, a crossroads where different dimensions and realities converge." He waved his hand dismissively. "The symbols on the walls, the artifacts on the pedestal, they're all part of an ancient language, one that holds the key to unlocking the secrets of the universe." I listened in awe as he outlined his theories, each one more outlandish than the last. He spoke of parallel universes, alternate realities, and dimensions beyond our own. It was like he was speaking a different language, one that I couldn't quite understand. But despite my reservations, I couldn't help but feel drawn to his enthusiasm, to the sense of possibility that hung in the air like a challenge. "We're not just scientists, Doctor," Newton said, his eyes glinting with mischief. "We're explorers, charting new territory and pushing the boundaries of human knowledge." He turned to one of our team members, a young woman named Sarah who had been quiet until now. "Sarah, what do you make of this place?" he asked, his gaze expectant. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting back and forth as if searching for an answer. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke the words that would change everything. "I think we're being watched." As Sarah spoke, the room seemed to darken, as if the very light itself was being drained from it. The mist that swirled around us began to take on a life of its own, twisting and writhing like living tendrils. Dr. Newton's eyes never left mine, his gaze burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "We're not alone here," he repeated, his voice low and menacing. "And we're not the only ones who have been watching us. The words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, and I felt myself responding to them, feeling a growing sense of unease and fear. Sarah took a step back, her eyes wide with terror. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Dr. Newton just smiled, his teeth glinting in the dim light. "The island has a way of getting inside your head," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "And once it's there, it won't let go." The mist seemed to be closing in around us, suffocating me. I felt my grip on reality begin to slip like sand between my fingers. Dr. Newton took another step closer, his eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. "We're all just pawns in a much larger game," he said, his voice rising to a shout. "And we're going to have to play by its rules if we want to survive." Sarah stumbled backwards, her eyes fixed on the door behind us. She reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me towards her. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, her breath hot against my ear. But it was too late. The island had already gotten inside our heads, and nothing would ever be the same again. Dr. Newton's eyes seemed to gleam with an unholy light as he rummaged through the ancient artifacts on the pedestal. He produced a small, ornate box made of what looked like human bone, adorned with strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. "This is it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. "This is the key to unlocking the secrets of the island." Sarah's eyes were wide with horror as Dr. Newton opened the box, revealing a collection of strange, pulsing orbs that seemed to throb with an otherworldly energy. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up one of the orbs, holding it up for us to see. "Behold," he whispered, his voice dripping with reverence, "the essence of the island itself." As I watched in growing horror, Dr. Newton's eyes seemed to change, his pupils expanding to an unnatural size as he gazed into the orb. His body began to twist and contort, his limbs elongating like rubber as he stumbled backwards, the orb still clutched in his hand. "It's happening," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "He's being changed." And then, in an instant, Dr. Newton was no longer recognizable as human. His body had transformed into something grotesque and twisted, his face elongating into a snout-like visage as he let out a blood-curdling scream. The orbs on the pedestal seemed to pulse with energy as Dr. Newton's new form lunged at us, its eyes blazing with an unnatural hunger. The air was thick with the stench of decay as Dr. Newton's new form lunged at us, its eyes blazing with an unnatural hunger. We were frozen in terror, unable to move or speak as the creature bore down on us. But then, something inside me snapped. I remembered the words of Dr. Newton himself, his obsession with unlocking the secrets of the island, and I knew that we couldn't just stand there and wait to be devoured. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "Sarah, we need to get out of here," I whispered urgently, my eyes locked on the creature's twisted face. Sarah nodded, her own voice barely audible over the sound of our own ragged breathing. "We have to find a way to stop it." Together, we made a break for the door, the creature giving chase as we stumbled through the winding corridors of the island's ancient temple. We could hear its labored breathing, its twisted body crashing through the stone as it pursued us. But I knew that we couldn't outrun it forever. I needed to find a way to stop Dr. Newton, to restore him to his human form before it was too late. And so I made a decision. "Sarah, I need you to distract it," I whispered urgently. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I'll try." She took a deep breath, her hand grasping for something in the darkness as she prepared to face our monstrous pursuer alone. Sarah took a step forward, her eyes locked on the creature's twisted face. She raised her hand, and to my horror, she began to chant in a voice that was both familiar and yet utterly alien. The words seemed to come from some deep well of knowledge within her, and they resonated with an otherworldly power. The creature slowed its approach, its eyes fixed on Sarah as if mesmerized by her words. And then, in an instant, it was frozen in place, its body suspended in midair as if time itself had been paused. Sarah took advantage of the reprieve to grab a nearby torch and fling it at the creature's face. The flame engulfed it, and for a moment I thought we might finally be safe. But then the creature's body began to contort and twist, its limbs elongating like rubber as it let out a deafening screech. Sarah stumbled backwards, her eyes wide with terror as she watched in horror as Dr. Newton's body began to merge with the creature's. His face elongated into a snout-like visage, his eyes bulging from their sockets as he howled in rage. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of our own ragged breathing. "This can't be happening." Sarah stumbled towards me, her hand grasping for mine as she collapsed to the ground beside me. "It's too late," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Dr. Newton's monstrous form. "He's gone." As I watched in horror, Dr. Newton's body continued to twist and contort, his face elongating into a snout-like visage as he let out a deafening screech. The torch that Sarah had thrown at him was now nothing but a smoldering ruin, the flames dying down to embers as the creature's body began to engulf it. I knew then that we were running out of time. We had to get off the island and fast. But how? Dr. Newton's transformation was complete, and he was now a monstrous version of himself, driven solely by a hunger for destruction. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine as it began to move towards me. Sarah's hand grasped mine, her eyes wide with fear as we stumbled backwards through the winding corridors of the temple. But no matter how fast we ran, the creature was always just behind us, its labored breathing echoing off the stone walls. We were trapped in a living nightmare from which there was no escape. And then suddenly we saw it, the core of the island's horror, the source of Dr. Newton's transformation. A glowing portal pulsed with an otherworldly energy, its mouth open wide like a maw of eternal darkness. The creature loomed behind us, its eyes fixed on the portal as if drawn by some unseen force. And then, in a moment that would haunt me forever, it spoke. "Welcome," it growled, its voice like thunder in my mind. "You will never leave this place." As I gazed into the portal, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The creature's words echoed in my mind, and I knew that we were staring into the very heart of madness itself. Sarah's hand tightened around mine, her eyes wide with terror as she whispered a single word, "Run!" But it was too late. The portal began to pulse with an intense, blinding light, and I felt myself being drawn towards it like a moth to flame. Dr. Newton's monstrous form loomed behind us, its eyes fixed on the portal as if waiting for something to emerge from the depths of hell itself. And then, in an instant, the world around us began to distort and writhe like a living thing. The stone walls seemed to twist and contort, revealing hidden symbols etched into the very fabric of reality. The air was filled with an unearthly energy, as if the very laws of nature themselves were being twisted and distorted. And then, from the heart of the portal, something emerged. A figure unlike any I had ever seen, its form shifting and flowing like a liquid. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly fire, and its presence seemed to fill the entire temple with an unspeakable horror. "This is the one," Dr. Newton growled, his voice like thunder in my mind. "The source of all horror." The figure began to move towards us, its form shifting and flowing like a living thing, and I knew that we were staring into the face of pure, unadulterated madness. As the figure drew closer, its form seemed to shift and writhe like a living thing, Its eyes burned with an otherworldly fire, and its presence filled me with an unspeakable horror. I knew that we were staring into the face of pure, unadulterated madness. Sarah's hand tightened around mine, her eyes wide with terror as she whispered a single word: "Run." But it was too late. The figure began to speak, its voice like thunder in my mind. "You should not have come here," it growled. "Now you will never leave." As the words left its lips, the temple around us began to collapse. The walls crumbled, the ceiling caved in, and I felt myself being swept up in a tide of darkness. I stumbled through the wreckage, my hand still clutched around Sarah's as we desperately sought a way out. But every door we opened led only to more corridors, more chambers filled with unspeakable horrors. And at every turn, the figure was there, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. We were trapped in a living nightmare from which there was no escape. I knew that if we didn't find a way out soon, we would be consumed by the very darkness that surrounded us. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening into abyssal voids. I could feel my grip on reality beginning to slip, and I knew that Sarah was right. We had to keep moving or risk being trapped forever in this descent into madness.